The romance novel, constantly looked down upon in literary communities, constantly outselling every other genre of note. Obviously, a controversial existence. It is a near universal experience within literary life that at some point one runs into the concept of the romance genre and is alerted to its silly reputation. What sets people apart is whether they agree to follow that common notion, or if they decide to put the common narrative about the genre aside. When my mother was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, in what was at the time a relatively conservative household, my grandmother greatly encouraged my mother's love of reading, with the main exception being to her desire to read romance novels.
You were talking about romances and my telling Erin she shouldn't read romances. All I was recalling was when she was, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old.
Pretty young.
She asked me, Mom, what does the word rape mean? And I said, what are you reading?
I love that you automatically know I'm reading something.
She always encouraged my brother and I to accept romance novels as we would any other literature while we were growing up. But there were always parts of that common narrative that prevailed in how she spoke about these books. She was commonly referring to books that she was reading as being horrible, trashy romance novels, which she felt the need to frame as a guilty pleasure rather than something she truly enjoyed.
We were all calling them trashy romances in middle school and high school. As if it were its own genre. It doesn't mean bookstores would. They just call them romance. But all of the girls that I knew that were reading them, it was only girls reading them. Because that's who they were aimed at. They were not aimed at a male readership at all. We all called them that. And I don't know if that's something that some of the girls whose mothers read them, if they'd heard their mothers calling them that. But yeah, there is also kind of the sense of it's a guilty pleasure. I might as well acknowledge that.
What stuck out the most to me when I was young, however, was how she talked about these novels' cover. When I was growing up, and ebooks still weren't really a thing yet, every week we would go to the public library in our town and we'd pick out our books for the week. I'd pick out my little third grader books, and she'd pick out a novel for herself from the romance section. And every week, without fail, she would comment on the covers. She complained about the explicit nature of the covers of her youth and how she couldn't cover up what she was reading.
Even then, I found the kind of, here is the muscular, really muscular, masculine man who's going to save the woman. I know that's what I'm reading, but somehow also having that luridly pictured on the cover, it seemed too much. Part of it, though, is that I'm just not very visual. So, I don't feel a need to try to paint a picture in my head of what these people look like. And so if it's always like the same three models, it's boring. But it also proclaims to everyone that you're reading a trashy romance, right? It's, and then you get the looks of, you're too young for that, or why would you waste your time on that, or I'm sorry, I thought you were a serious academic. Why are you reading that? So, yeah, there's kind of a, let's just say I'm really glad that now I can check out all of my books on my iPad. Not just because it means I don't have to pay attention to when the due date is, but also because nobody knows what I'm reading. And that's a good thing.
At the time, I had no clue what the big deal was. And pretty soon after, when I was in like 5th grade or so, she switched to digital reading on her iPad. And that made the covers unimportant and never really something that I could have brought up to her. But it was still a subject for curiosity, simply one that I never was able to look into, because, well, I had other things to be doing, and it didn't come up in conversation again. But it stuck with me. Why on earth did she feel the need to speak about the books that she read and loved so much in the way that she did? And why did the covers change? Like, she constantly complained about. And why on earth are these covers important in the first place? So, I did some research. First of all, it's important to note that there isn't much good scholarly research in this. It's not really something that is well documented due to the silly narrative given to romance novels as a whole. So, what there is on the genre in scholarly, peer reviewed articles is very few and far between. But what is covered, at least a little bit, is the general history of the romance novel, as well as a tiny bit of public sources about the general history of romance novels, and there is also a fair bit of research done into how these things impact readers. But more in depth research is most definitely necessary, so please do your own research. This is just what I've found, and if someone watching this is a important person that can research this more and do proper research, that would be great. Yeah. Um so what I'm going to be talking about here, just blanket in this video, I will, as much as I hate those, but in this video, I will be getting into general history of romance novels, history of covers, and the impacts that has had on readers today. What I will not be talking about is intersection of romance novels and the representation of racial and sexual minorities, or the ways that these novels influence perceptions of gender, simply because there's not enough time, and also because the amount of research is not as much there as I would like to cover. Anywho, the history of the romance novel, as well as the history of its covers, are pretty well documented. Pamela Regis dedicated an entire book to documenting the history of the romance novel. I highly encourage you to check it out. I've linked it in the caption, so check it out. And with countless precursors of romantic stories and literature for people to draw on, Regis credits Samuel Richardson's 1740 novel, Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, as the first modern romance novel. Now, this book is a story following a 15-year-old maidservant named Pamela Andrews as she receives very much unwanted and inappropriate advances from her employer, who's just called Mr. B. Like, just B, the letter, no extra anything. Um and then this whole time he's just being a horrible person to her and other women, and it's a mess until he decides, yeah, okay, I just want her, and they get married, and then the rest of the book is just her learning how to live as a wealthy woman instead of a maidservant. It's it's a lot to unpack, and I'm not a fan. Not a fan. Anywho, moving on. But what it did do was it showed the general literary world that a story revolving around romantic endeavors was interesting enough to audiences to be sold. You no longer needed to have a book be about something else and just have a romantic subplot. You could have a book that was just romance, which very important development, and spawned the romance genre. This genre then continued on through the works of Jane Austen, of Brontë sisters, and has maintained enough relevance for us to still enjoy it at a pretty widespread basis to this day, which is pretty cool. And then it's important to note that stylized novel covers, like we know today with art and the title on the front instead of on the spine, only really came into popularity in the late 19th century and early 20th century as increased mechanization and book production came into play, and they were like, you know what, we're already making these super fast, we might as well add covers. And they did. Now, of course, book covers were popular in all other forms of literature, but cover art has had a very unique relationship with romance novels that we'll get into a bit later. And it quickly became a staple to the romance novel's identity, gave the reader a sneak peek into the plot and the general aesthetics of the book. And despite the controversy that these covers seem to bring up for whatever reason, very little academic research is done on this subject. So most of what we have is popular sources. So one of the main things that I found for this was an article for Time magazine by Olivia B. Waxman that will be linked down below as well, so feel free to check that out. She breaks the history of the romance novel cover into 7 different phases. We have the World War II era novels with illustrations that were loosely related to the content. They're just, you'd have girls with the wrong hair color. It was a whole thing, but they were somewhat related, only loosely. We have the so-called clinch covers of the 1960s and 1970s, where you have shirtless men holding on to women in like these precarious situations, and they've got this long, luscious hair flowing in the wind. It's a whole thing. We have the step back covers of these illustrated objects that allowed for more privacy in the 1980s. We have sexy single object covers that provide very limited information. Think Twilight. And that's the 2000s. We have big graphics and things that made look like they're made on Canva, as well as the bold lettering covers, so Sarah J. Maas type stuff. And finally, we have 7. Holding up numbers is hard. I'm going to stop doing that. 7th kind, we have a lot more covers that are more inclusive of racial and gender identities, mostly due to those topics being covered in the novels, but it's still a path forward. Yeah, seven genres there. And since there still is not much scholarly work, there is one other thing that I looked at for categorization on a website called bookcaseandcoffee.com. There was a user named Becky who instead put book covers into 4 categories. The clinch cover, which she had pretty much the same definition as Waxman, but instead puts them in the 1980s. So there's that. The object cover, which seems to be her name for the step back covers. The bare chest cover, where you have a photograph of just a shirtless man who's just kind of there. He's not really doing anything else. There's nothing else there. It's just him being shirtless. And finally, the vector illustrated cover, which is kind of a combination of Waxman's graphic covers and bold lettering covers. And what is noteworthy of both of these works is the attention that is paid to the category of the clinch cover. The two generally seem to agree on the overall definition, with Waxman defining them as, quote, book jackets featuring a couple in a passionate embrace, and the user on bookcaseandcoffee.com defining them as, quote, portraying muscular, bare-chested men tightly embracing a swooning woman, with her hair dramatically blowing in the wind and her dress clinging to her slender shoulders, end quote. In fact, the only real differences between the two and their attention to the clinch cover is Waxman's distinction between the clinch cover and the bodice ripper, and which, for context, the bodice ripper is specifically meant to refer to especially sexually explicit historical romance novels, and tend to include much more graphic depictions of violence and also sexual actions. And on top of her talking about the bodice ripper, she also takes the time to mention Harlequin Industries, the book publisher that popularized the clinch cover in the first place. So, what is Harlequin? Which is an important thing to note here. Harlequin was an absolute industry giant for the romance genre. It still largely is to this day. And while they're not the ones leading the trends anymore, one can only wonder why on earth the trends changed. And Marianne L. Fisher and Tammy Meredith decided to take a look into this in a journal article they called Evolutionary and Sociocultural Themes in Cover Art on Harlequin Romance Novels, a Temporal Analysis. And with this, they try and take advantage of Harlequin's vast history in the industry to break down the sales numbers across different genres of covers at different time periods. And as it turns out, these sale numbers tell a lot about the societal expectations in regard to sex and sexuality at the time of their release. As the pair put in their conclusion, and they say, quote, our findings reveal that the images on the covers agree with research on evolved mate preferences, and the way these preferences are displayed on the covers is in keeping with sociocultural norms. For covers published during decades when society was more sexually conservative and the occupational roles of women more limited, we observed a very tightly defined script as played in the lack of revealing clothing, for example. As time progressed, these roles loosened and women were shown in high status occupations or in sexier, more revealing clothing. More of the hero and heroine's bodies were shown, and the couples were depicted as engaging in direct eye contact with more physical contact. Therefore, changes in permissiveness regarding public displays of affection are echoed on Harlequin novels. The trends and covers of romance novels have undeniably changed, and that is in large part due to the work of Harlequin. But, as Meredith and Fisher do go on to say, romance has not changed, but how it is advertised and sold is socioculturally moderated, as increased permissiveness permits women's mate preferences to be more explicitly presented. Public perception of the genre as being intrinsically feminine has widely influenced the content of book covers, and vice versa, as we just covered. As a subgenre of romance, the chick lit novel arose alongside the popularization of feminist narratives in the 1990s and their depiction of women leading independent and successful lives while still managing to make time for their romantic endeavors without having to compromise their own livelihoods. The covers, however, were marketed in a very different manner to these themes that we're portraying. According to Riley and Pierce in their book, which is also linked below, quote, the thick, glossy metallic covers that had defined the 1980s design were replaced with sweetie colored covers in pastel shades, which identified a book as a woman's text. In books that were so fiercely defining themselves as subverting gender roles and encouraging female empowerment, they still needed to make their covers do the opposite in order to sell. Yeah. Yeah. But as time has passed, the gap between the interests of the audience and the choices made by the publishers in what kind of covers a novel should receive has remained a massive point of interest. In Walter Kendrick's piece, which linked below, you know the routine by now, he highlights the fanaticism around male models of romance novel covers, most notably the biggest star of the clinch cover, Fabio Lanzoni, which he is an interesting person as a whole. He's now in his 60s and is like somehow not looking all that bad, except he is also going on Fox News ranting about the dangers of soft masculinity and how it's just a trend that women want to date non-hyper masculine men and they'll just come around, stay hyper masculine. He's kind of disgusting. And by kind of, I mean very. I do not like this man. But for 60, he doesn't look too bad, which is, I mean, pretty on brand for him, honestly. He's a whole character. Annie. The Beast by Walter Kendrick. He talks about how enjoyers of romance novels fell in love with Fabio's long blonde hair and his muscles, and it earned mass notoriety for literally any book he appeared on. People began to demand more and more of him as his career went on, pushing the trend of just shirtless men into complete and utter nudity on book covers, which ended up pushing Fabio to remove himself from the industry and then made room for more models that looked fairly similar to him to then take on those roles. And it doesn't matter whether the story depicts modern sci-fi romances of the future, modern romances of the present, or period romances of the past, with their, quote, Scottish settings that allow for covers of bare-chested and muscled Highland lairds, as mentioned by Roach in her book, which is also linked below for you to check out. Because for years, the thought was that the cover had to be sexually appealing in order for people to read a romance novel. They won't otherwise. And with the levels of fanaticism that was at play at the time, they weren't entirely wrong. I mean, just the other day I saw on TikTok a video of a book event with an author that had a fire alarm pulled, and a bunch of firefighters walked in, and all hell broke loose because everyone was interested in the firefighters. That was an interesting thing. I don't know if I'm going to include that. Radaway, which another book in the description, check it out, also mentions an author of a historical novel that was written to be historical first, romance second. Just a romance subplot in there, mostly historical. But when publisher got a hold of it, and they insisted on marketing it as a romance, and just a romance. No change to the content, just like slap it in the romance section. And that ended up with the author being faced with mass scrutiny from both historical and romance fans who felt like they were led astray by this. In conclusion, people do judge a book by its cover. I mean, who wouldn't? It's the very first thing that someone can see about a book, except for the spine. But that's also part of the cover for most books. So, oh well. The cover tells the reader about the genre, the characters, the target audience, and so much more. The same story goes for romance novels. Covers tell the reader the very first things they need to know about the story. But the stories that covers themselves tell as a collective reveals who we are as a collective society. of both enjoyers and haters of romance novels, as well as who we are, who we've been, and who we will become.